Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a few things laid out here on the bench. I've got my grit, I got my gloves, and I've got the food that I'm going to feed to my European nightcrawlers, the ones that live in those yellow buckets over there. So every time we feed them at once. So we're going to go in there, give them their 8th feeding at this point. The system's been fed 7 times over the 96-day lifespan of the system. So today I'll be feeding number 8, and what we've been doing is kind of sticking to a 2-week interval every 14 days. Originally we fed 7 days after the system went into service, and then I think we waited 10 days till the next feeding, but after those first couple feedings we adopted the 14-day interval between feedings, and each feeding has been put onto sort of a opposite side as the previous feeding. So that's where I've come up with this concept of back and forth style feedings. I've got other systems where we're doing the same thing, but I'm trying not to use the same expression. So in another system we're calling it ping pong, going back and forth. So here I've attempted not to use that same expression. So we're going to get those buckets up here on the bench and give them today's feeding. Bucket 1 up here on the bench, as you can see, has some dead insects lying here on the cardboard. So that usually tells us that the position on the shelf that the system occupies has a companion insect catching guest. So there's probably a little spider web right above the system. And here, a little departure from what I normally do in a lot of my systems, which is cover up with plastic to keep the moisture from evaporating out of the system. Here I figured, with these high side walls and maybe not quite as much airflow happening as my more open systems, I figured maybe we'd be good with only a few sheets of cardboard and paper to protect the system from excessive drying. And taking that into account, it is pretty normal for the top surface here to be a little bit dry. Now, I've contemplated the idea of placing plastic over the tops of these systems to just make the top surface of the bin also just as much fair game for the worms inside as any other part of the system. But even so, I think we're doing okay here. It's just a little bit of dry stuff, and then you chip through that, you get down about an inch, and you're already in material where there's sufficient dampness and stuff to have worms in it. Right there we're already seeing a worm by not going even very deep. So besides the coverings, there was also a coffee filter on this edge of the bin to indicate to ourselves where we had last fed. So since we fed over here last time, this is the side that we're going to feed on today. But before we do that, we like to typically check how, after 14 days, the previous feeding is coming along. And in this particular case, I didn't really do a lot of prep work other than checking my spreadsheet to make sure the number of feedings and the age of the bin was accurately represented on my little information board. But I didn't review the video from last time, so I don't remember exactly what we fed in here. I'm just kind of getting this sense that it was something that might break down pretty quick, so we might not see a lot of leftovers of it. And so far I'm seeing, clumped up chunks of bedding with castings mixed in between them. I'm not really seeing anything that presents itself as leftovers. Some of what I'm seeing here could potentially be some coffee, but it's really tough to tell down here in the bucket. So it's quite possible that they've done away with the majority of what they were fed last time. You know what, let's just do a slightly more intrusive sort of upending of the entire feeding area. I'm just curious to bring some of the stuff that's down low up to get a better look at it. I guess more of the same, moisture sitting down low, bedding mixed with castings. No real signs of any leftovers. So I guess next time we come in here, this corner, or this, not corner, the side of the bin will be definitely ready for more food. So that means the other side of the bin has already had not 14 days, but 28 days to break down whatever food was placed in there last. And then even if there's leftovers, we're going to place in today's portion. Here again, I can't recall what was in here, but For some reason on this side I've got this recollection of cantaloupes for some reason. And typically it's not the sort of thing you're going to expect to see a lot of leftovers of. Perhaps the outer skin of the rind or something. Some of that tougher material that doesn't break down quite so quickly. Here it seems like the concentration of castings relative to the bedding in here is a little bit higher. So maybe there's just been more worm traffic on this side. I've kind of had this theory. It's getting warmer now, but all winter long I've been wondering if the side of the bin that faces into the room, in this case it's the side right here that's got the label stuck to it on the outside. So the label faces into the room so I can read it. And this is the side that might be, here again, it's just theory, but it might be a little tiny bit warmer than the other side that's up against the wall where some of the cool outside air can sneak in. Sometimes I wonder if worms are gravitating to this side of the container because it's the side that faces into the room and might be a little tiny bit warmer. Alright, so it seems like, you know, maybe as things warm up, maybe as the worms start to get a little bit more active, as the temperatures rise, maybe we're going to see some quicker action. Maybe we got to pick up the pace on these feedings. This looks to me like a little chunk of cantaloupe rind. If that's all the leftovers we're going to find in here, then it's a pretty good thing we're in here to feed because it's due. So I'm just tilling things up down here a little bit. I'm not going to excavate entirely because as we go, each time we feed, we usually throw in another handful or two of bedding to help build out the overall volume of the space that these worms have to live in inside these buckets. It just makes it harder and harder for me to excavate more and more material each time to get to the bottom, but that's actually a pretty good size hole that I've created here, and I've got my supply of pre-built bedding. I'm going to grab a handful of that, and it's a pretty generous handful. I'm going to plop that right down into the hole, and then I'm going to bring in some of the food that they're getting. It's coffee. So I've emptied about, I don't know, the better part of this filter here. So I've got 2 of these full filters to feed to 3 systems. So I'm going to try to share the coffee. I like putting it on my shredded bedding because then it feels like the material is all separated from each other. A whole bunch of food mixed in with the bedding and doesn't obscure any of the food from being approached. So here too, same way we gave them about 1/3 of the available coffee that we have to give them today. I would have to say that that's about 1/3 of what's in this bag. The last system's going to get not so much bananas, but maybe mushrooms. That's what's on the bottom of this bag, but I didn't really worry about trying to, make sure everyone gets an equal number of banana peels and an equal number of chunks of mushroom. I think they'll just have to be happy with what they're getting. So here's the grit. It's pulverized eggshell in my case. And I'm trying to think here. We gave them 1/3 of the coffee. We gave them 1/3 of the food and grit as well. So I've got this soiled paper towel down here that we can include with the feeding. And sometimes I like to take the old coffee filter that was resting out on the top. Here's the one that we were using before and just include it as part of the bedding to go with the feeding. But we're going to keep using this particular filter here. But in the other 2 systems, we'll probably reuse the old filter because we've got 2 new filters here that are going to be ready to go to be used as replacement feeding zone indicators. But I think we're set to start leveling things off here. I did make sort of an active effort, I don't know if you noticed, to try to get a lot of that dry stuff that I was out on the surface blended in with more damp materials and some more castings. I've got a feeling that as time progresses, this material, as it becomes less shredded paper and leaves and becomes more castings, it'll require less and less help to keep its moisture content, and it won't evaporate quite as quickly and lose its moisture. So we fed on this side, so we're putting the feeding zone indicator to show us where we last fed on top of the feeding, and then back in can come the paper coverings, paper and cardboard coverings, which are actually doing a pretty good job in here. Okay, so that was kind of exploratory, kind of getting caught up on how things are doing in the systems. We'll see if we can get the other two fed a little bit more quickly and less chit-chat. So here in bucket 2, as luck would have it, the piece of cardboard that I fashioned the covering out of had this little scribble on it that almost looks like a number 2. So this system actually has its own little internal markings to help with identification. Here and there I see some flying insects. I'm trying to do certain things in certain systems, as well as laying out some traps and stuff like that to see if I can combat the presence of these little flying insects. So once again, the last feeding on this side probably doesn't show a lot of signs of leftovers, similar to what we saw in the other bin, but you never know. Even though these systems are very similar in terms of how they're built and how they've been managed and fed and everything, they do have little, unique characteristics. So for example, I believe that the third one, the last one we're going to feed, was one where we included a whole bunch of old bedding materials that came out of the cocoon nursery that was spawned off after the castings that these guys came out of was harvested. And where is this the system? There's all kinds of, oh, we got a coffee filter. Maybe that was just applied with one of the recent feedings. This even looks like maybe just a big chunk of coffee. Would I have done that? Just throw a big wad of coffee in here and not blend it in? Well, at this point we're going to blend it in, if it's in fact coffee. And I don't know, is this food or just clumped up bedding bits? If that was coffee, and I think it was, then those do register as leftovers and do appear to be a little bit more than any leftovers we observed in the previous system. In fact, I don't think I really even saw anything which to me resembled leftover coffee, but I could have just missed it. Could have been there. So here too, over on this side, I'm curious to see what we're going to have as far as leftovers go. Here again, just trying to break apart some of this drier material and blend it in with the neighboring damp stuff. And then luckily the bedding that I'm throwing in here, the pre-made bedding, is quite damp as well. I added to it yesterday and gave the whole system a good, well, not system, the supply, gave the whole supply of pre-made bedding a really good soaking. And that included some of the stuff that was already in there, some of the older stuff. And that's what I'm using, is the more aged, mature pre-made bedding. And give the newly made stuff a little time to break in, soften up for feeding purposes. So I think on this side we're seeing much the same as we saw in bucket number 1. Just a whole bunch of castings, some worms hanging out. No real signs of leftovers as far as I can tell. It's kind of nice now that stuff has become kind of more inundated with castings. Stuff allows me to kind of stack it up a little bit more easily than if it was all dry, crumbly stuff, but I still feel like I'm unable to get all the way to the bottom, which is fine. We don't need to go all the way to the bottom. Just want to give this hole a good amount of space so we can be real generous with the bedding and get the food in there, and then also at the same time make sure it gets thoroughly covered up at the end. So whatever. Not going to keep trying to open up the hole if it keeps crumbling. I think that's the best we're going to do. So in comes another pretty large and generous handful of pre-made bedding. The system, being 96 days of age at this point, is sort of in that category of, getting pretty mature. So like I said, we're going to set this new filter aside and we'll grab the old one and include it as additional bedding for the feeding. We'll even tear it up a little bit so it doesn't show up as large leftovers next time we're in here. Possibly help with the breakdown process, and then let's also help this coffee blend in. I've got a little bit more coffee over here. Oops, okay. We're going to leave a little bit for the last system for bucket number 3, but this one just got a whole dousing of coffee. But I think by blending it in, it's going to well, it's going to mask it from me being able to spot it next time. So even if it's there as leftovers, it'll not be quite as obvious. But yeah, I think just by being all separated like that, it also probably helps a lot with its consumption rather than just being mounded up. So here too, maybe at this point we can give these guys a little bit of mushroom too, in addition to the banana peels. Oh, and I think what we left for the last system is a nice ample quantity so that we've got pretty much an equal feeding in all three. So we're gonna give them a little bit of grit down here too, and can't recall if we covered up with yet more pre-made bedding, but we'll do so here just in case it needs it. I don't think this system needs it. All these systems have been given tons and tons of bedding. I've been really wanting to increase the size of this space on each occasion when we come in here to feed, so that hopefully the inhabitants sort of sense that there's plenty of room in here. They can lay out a bunch of cocoons and have a bunch of babies, and that there'll be space and food enough for everyone. So hopefully, even though we started all of these with an estimated only 400 inhabitants, hopefully by the end of the game we're going to have buckets with many, many more. Not only the previously added adult worms, but also a whole bunch of little babies. So we got one more to feed, and then we're done. Okay, here we go. Bucket number 3 of 3. Oops. And once again, we've got a brand new filter over there that we're going to use as the replacement feeding zone indicator. So while we're feeding, we could use this old seasoned piece of paper as now bedding. It's even got a little bit of mold growing on it, which is a little bit of an added bonus. So let's see here. Dryness, much the same. Overall level, much the same. A couple little flying insects, possibly not as bad as what we saw on the other one. And here too, I don't know if we're going to bump into leftover coffee or leftover anything, but I believe this was the system that we estimated to have the fewest number of worms. And that might not even be the case. It's always kind of an illusion what you're encountering. Somehow the worms don't always reveal from casual observation what's really going on in their systems. So yeah, this is where we had recycled a whole bunch of old bedding bits from yeah, I guess different places, probably mostly from the cocoon nursery. So rather than using a coffee filter or pre-made bedding down in here last time, or maybe it was even a previous feeding, I don't remember. It was pretty recently, I think, that we went ahead and dumped in a bunch of cardboard and paper in here instead of the shredded fine stuff that all the other systems get. And I think I see some coffee leftovers. And what is this? Finally, a leftover piece of food that we could check out. An intact, identifiable piece. It's bigger than a little piece of cantaloupe rind. Here we have a mango seed. Try not to spray myself with the springiness of the shell. See little worms like hanging out in there. I guess that's the big benefit of these buckets, is I can make a mess down here and splash around in the mud. And luckily the sides of the bucket protect me from getting filthy. So I'm just aerating the contents down here. There's a good amount of moisture. Evidently there's some leftover foods down here, which the worms are continuing to break down. But here again, I think once the time comes to return to this side of the system to feed again, it'll be a welcome addition, because there's really not a lot of leftovers other than a couple shells of mangoes. And every now and then I feel something that seems like it could be a piece of leftover food, but it's just leftover large chunks of bedding, which is unique to this bucket of the 3. Everywhere else we've been using pretty finely chopped up bedding bits to help its breakdown process. So let's move things aside so we can get this last feeding applied into this last system. Here too, I don't know what to expect as far as leftovers go. Maybe we'll see a cantaloupe rind. Who knows, maybe we'll see more. Maybe we'll see less. Definitely a good amount of castings down here, blended in with the neighboring bedding. These Just kind of aerating and checking it out. Moisture levels seem pretty decent. There's a large chunk of probably just bedding clumped together with some castings. Anything that's kind of larger, I just have this tendency to kind of roll it around in my hand until it feels like it's crumbling into small particles. This way we can find if there's any leftovers, we'll see them, but here again, I don't think we're going to see much of that, if any. I just thought, for a second, I thought I saw like the stem of a banana peel or something, but I think I was mistaken. Let's see if we can stack up and open up a big enough void down here to apply today's yummy foods. Okay. Yeah, I like the way these systems are coming along. Certainly nothing to worry about as far as I'm concerned. I think the, oops, before we put the coffee in, let's drop in some pre-made bedding underneath. It always seems like the right thing to do when I'm blending in the coffee with these shredded bits of cardboard and paper. And this will be our new feeding zone indicator. Let's grab the old one along with the mold that's growing on it already and supplement the bedding supply down here with this stuff. Yeah, 96 days. You know, at some point after about 100 days, 100 days is when I start thinking about the materials that I put into a system. Usually I'm pretty easygoing about what I'm putting in, and even like those mango seeds that you saw a moment ago. Those things will take forever. In fact, those probably even came with the worms from the previous system, so sometimes a piece of food like that can outlive a bin and go with the worms into their new system. So at this point, around 100 days, I start thinking about applying foods that are going to break down pretty readily. Even the bedding, if I'm using bedding still, stuff that's going to hopefully not leave behind all kinds of scraps and stuff. Even if you look through my bedding, it does include leaves, which includes the stems of leaves, and it's these little suckers that always seem to take the longest in my systems to break down. So, pretty good feeding here. Banana, mushroom, bedding, grit. So far we've not had to apply moisture. I've you know, contemplated adding moisture to these systems in recent check-ins. But luckily down low, the material's perfect and the worms all seem to be pretty happy and healthy in here. So I think I'm going to keep going with it, you know. At no point did we ever cover up with plastic, and at this point I'm starting to think that at no point will we ever have to. Not to say that we won't find some reason to find that to be the beneficial action to take, but here I think we're just going to keep covering with paper and cardboard because it's working well. So that's it for our feeding of the yellow buckets and the European nightcrawlers that inhabit them. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.